Hello, and welcome back to the Southern Bible Thumper channel. I'm Cam, and for this video, we will be reading Exodus chapter 1. Now, these are the names of the children of Israel, which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass that, when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom, and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of servants in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, When ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him; but if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said unto them, Why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied, and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. Summarizing Exodus chapter 1. So the lineage of the children of Israel are the descendants of Jacob slash Israel in the book of Genesis. 70 people came from Jacob slash Israel to Egypt, Joseph included. Joseph was the son that was sold into slavery by his brothers. He was the governor during the famine, and he brought his family over after he established himself in Egypt. In verse 6, Joseph, the governor, and his relatives in his generation died. Verse 8, a new king of Egypt came into rulership. He saw that the children of Israel slash Jacob were numerous, feared that they would win in the event of war because the Egyptians feared that they would side with the enemy. Verse 11, the Egyptians set taskmasters. The New International Version says they set slave masters. In the New Living Translation, this verse says that the Egyptians made the children of Israel their slaves. This was done to make their lives exceptionally harder. The Egyptians made the children of Israel build 2 cities, Pithom and Ramses. The more the Egyptians afflicted them, the more the children of Israel grew in number. The Egyptians made every task for Hebrews exceptionally difficult and made their lives bitter, by verse 15. King told the king or the Pharaoh. Pharaoh and king are interchangeable, but just in Egypt they call the king the Pharaoh. Pharaoh told Hebrew midwives to kill male Hebrews at birth, but not the female. In verse 17, the midwives feared God. and did not obey this order. In verse 18, Pharaoh asks the midwives why they have not killed the Hebrew male babies. And the midwives tell him that Hebrew women are more vigorous than Egyptian women, and they give birth before the midwives can arrive. In verse 20, God was good to the midwives because they feared God. Having concern for his ways, instead of obeying the Egyptians' orders, God provided for them as a reward for obedience. In verse 22, Pharaoh said that every son born shall be cast into the river, and every daughter should live. Highlights of Exodus chapter 1. The Egyptian king developed a fear of Hebrews because of their large numbers. In Genesis chapter 43, verse 32, Joseph's brothers came to his home to eat, unaware that he was Hebrew because he was still playing the role of an Egyptian governor. So when his brothers came to visit, he brought them to the house, to his home, had them, eat, but because he was playing the role of an Egyptian, the Egyptian servants in his household and himself, they went to a different room. That was the custom during that time, and it was considered an abomination for Hebrews and Egyptians to eat together, and that was an Egyptian culture. In chapter 39, verse 17, Joseph's supervisor's wife wanted to sleep with him, and he refused. And when she was able to speak with her husband, she told him, "The Hebrew servant you brought to our home came here to disrespect me." So there is already an underlying dynamic between Egyptians and Hebrews in the Egyptian culture, where Hebrews are undesirable or lesser. With this new leader, they are now concerned with the high numbers of the Hebrews. Verse 9 and 10. The Egyptian king developed the notion that because Hebrews were numerous, that they had the ability to overtake them if they joined forces with an enemy during a time of war. The assumption that they would choose to go against the Egyptians during wartime was present. This is an assumption, an unfounded assumption at that. In verse 12, confirming that this was a fear that the Egyptians had, or at least that Egyptian king had, in verse 12, the Egyptians were grieved because of the Hebrew population. They were grieved because of their capacity and their ability, not for any action that they actually took, just the capacity that these Hebrews could turn against the Egyptians, especially remembering how they're thought of in Egyptian culture, and now there's a lot of them. In verse 10, the king of Egypt feared that the Hebrews would not only fight against them, but that they would also leave the country. The king of Egypt was concerned that they would, one, join forces with an enemy, and two, leave the country. So they were concerned about their numbers and made their lives bitter, but also were concerned that they would leave the country. In verse 11, in response to that assumption that the Hebrews would someday join forces and fight against the Egyptians, responding to that assumption, they set taskmasters and slave masters. The Hebrews were enslaved to afflict them, to make their lives bitter, and made them build two cities in verse 14. The second thing that the Egyptians instated to instated is instate a word? Let me look at that up real quick. Okay, instate is a word because reinstate is a word, but I wasn't sure if instate was a word. Cool. Instate is a word. So the second behavior that the Egyptians instated was to kill the male children in their infancy before they can become men. So in this chapter, when this group of people were targeted for their capacity, for their ability, The actions from the Egyptians were to prohibit them from becoming more fruitful by one, making their lives increasingly rigorous, two, killing the men off, affecting the man's ability to produce severely. To carry out their agenda to stop the Hebrew population from growing, the Egyptians went to Hebrew women, hoping to negatively affect the Hebrew man. An Egyptian woman was not appointed to carry out an Egyptian plan. It was a Hebrew who the Egyptians went to when they wanted their plan carried out. A Hebrew woman would have had access because of her ethnicity and also because she had access to male infants. In verse 12, the more the Egyptians afflicted the Hebrews, the more they grew in number. And the Egyptians thought that they could get these Hebrew women to help stop that. So that's who they approached. In verse 17, the midwives feared God and was rewarded in verse 21 for not obeying the order to harm newborns. God did not reward them because they had a response, that they were responding in terror of God. The reward was for reverence and for respect. Genesis chapter 9 verse 5, God holds us accountable for murdering humans. Keeping this commandment is respect for God. The word feared, if we look up feared, it includes the definition fear. In the definition, the word fear is included, or that is the definition of feared. It's so when we look up the definition of feared, it's an adjective and it includes the root word fear. When we look at this, if you don't know what fear means already, typing this word with this suffix, ed is a suffix. And the way that you know this is because when you type the entire word in, the definition includes the root word. That's how you can tell if there are any additions to a word. This will not help you to understand what feared means. So you're going to have to look up the word fear in order to understand. And the reason why I even want to go over this is because with the Christian faith, when as you are reading, you will see that the word feared is often used. And this is not every word has more than one definition in the English language. And the most used or the most popular definition of the word is not the only definition, which is why it's important to, as you're reading, when you see these words, especially fearing God, it it's important to look up what this means just to make sure we're getting the correct information because again, the most popular definition is not the only definition, and you can use the word for any definition that is underneath a word, right? So the first noun, of course, most of these are unpleasant. We have unpleasant, strong emotion, instance of this emotion, state marked by this emotion. But when we get down here, we have anxious concern, which is solicitude, but I'm going to click on that later. But we have here profound reverence and awe, especially towards God. And when we come down here to the verb, we have to have a reverential awe of, to fear God. So fear doesn't just mean something unpleasant, it also means a profound reverence for God. When we look at anxious concern, solicitude, the state of being concerned and anxious, attentive care and protectiveness, an attitude of earnest concern or attention, a cause of care and concern. This helps you to understand why this word fear was chosen. Also, we have to remember that this is an antiquated text, and there wasn't as many vocabulary words during this time as there are now. So that's something to take into account. But Reading this without paying attention or without doing a little more research to understand, these women were not rewarded for being terrified of God. The fear that's mentioned here is keeping God's commandment, being concerned about what God wants done on earth. That's what this is referencing. The last thing to note here in verse 22, Hebrew male infants were ordered to be thrown in the river to die. The men, before they could even become men as they were infants, newborns, they were ordered to be thrown in the river if they were Hebrew. When the Egyptian king wanted to slow the growth of the Hebrews, he ordered the deaths of the male population. A few questions that I have still after reading this chapter. Would Hebrew men or Hebrew people in this society choose to withdraw from interacting with each other beyond what was mandatory to avoid producing a male child in that society? Was it common to have Hebrews carry out Egyptian orders against other Hebrews? These midwives had access to other Hebrews because of their ethnicity, credibility because of their skill set as midwife, and they were the perfect candidates to get close enough to Hebrews to harm them without them being suspicious. How severely was the Hebrew population impacted? Were the males severely outnumbered once this became an ordinance? Males weren't allowed to grow into fully functioning men deliberately, all because of an unfounded fear from the Pharaoh. How were the Hebrew men treated in this society, dedicated to killing them? Did any of them regret their existence? Did any of them regret being Hebrew or being men? Those are questions that I wondered. I see a lot of parallels in today's society. S- I see a lot of parallels, and I just wonder. I'm excited about getting through Exodus chapter 1. The next upload will be Exodus chapter 2. Thank you for watching me up until this point. Have a good night.